Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining Blue Card's webinar entitled What's Clouding the Cloud for the Insurance Sector. My name is James Stolberg, and I'll be collecting any questions you may have during the presentation. We will address all of your questions at the end of the presentation during our Q&A session. To submit a question, just please hover over the chat box icon at the top of your screen and submit your questions via instant message directly to Karen Regan. The submission of your questions will be a private communication between you and Blue Card. At this time, I am pleased to begin the presentation by announcing Simon de Montfort Walker, Blue Card's Executive Vice President of Operations. Simon?
Thanks, James. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what the case may be. Thanks for joining us. One of a series of webinars we're doing focused on a couple of topics. Today we're going to talk a little bit about cloud. So, as James said, put questions in towards the end. I'll kind of move through this so we've got lots of time for questions, and if we get a few minutes to end early, that's great. So what we wanted to sort of go through was a fairly open discussion around some core topics on adoption barriers, some of the benefits of these kind of utility models of computing, software, and technology. A couple of the sort of core differences that we certainly see, and I think most people do, in terms of size of enterprise and what the benefits really are. But then really I think the heart of the matter is a discussion on some of the benefits, some of the reasons we see some adoption issues, and then more importantly to really kind of connect this to, I think, some of the bigger trends in IT and in technology and in business in general right now. And then just talk through kind of some of the vendors, some of the tools, some of the opportunities out there, and how all of those things fit together to an endpoint. We'll talk a little bit about certainly how we use some of these things in our environment, how we've used them in former lives, and certainly some of the activity we see in third parties. So, as I said, we'll keep this fairly open. We'll really push for questions and maybe discussion at the end. So James, if you want to bob forward one, let's get cracking. There we go. So as with all big technology trends, this is another that is kind of a little bit amorphous in terms of its definition. Technologists get excited about it, tend to overcomplicate sort of the definition as well as really what it is to the business, if you will. So certainly from my perspective, it's pretty simple. We're really just talking about utility models and, models of either infrastructure, software, or frankly even people handling processes that we're treating really as a utility, where we're paying by the sort of the smallest unit of consumption. So whether there's really kind of three large groups within cloud that people talk about: infrastructure as a service, which is really the traditional sort of cloud offering, along with platforms as a service, which you might see as kind of, we'll talk a little bit about Amazon. That's a great classic definition. And then I think what's most popular in the business universe, which is really the sort of software as a service, where we're taking utility models and actually delivering software to the desktop with them. In terms of, I think the real benefits and the risks, certainly we're known as a risk-averse industry. I think we actually have a lot of just cause for that, and there's real reasons why we should be kind of a little bit lagging on some of these things. I also think we're shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit just in terms of the fact that, look, in the vendor space and in the internal IT space, we've done poorly defining some of these benefits and really what this means to business users. In the grandest scheme possible, when we look at it, I think 20, 30, 40 years ago, I don't think any business user looked at a technologist and said, I'd like software, I'd like hardware, I'd like infrastructure, and maybe I'll get some functionality on the back side of that. It was really the other way around, right? People sought functionality. They wanted to be able to manipulate and use data. And the sort of vendor community and the infrastructure world responded that you needed to buy those three things, integrate them, and then you'd get there. And really what we're seeing is kind of the ultimate turn on that, where we're finally at a point where we're really worrying about delivering functionality to business users, and this is part of this utility model. The cloud model is really part of the ultimate end to deliver functionality to business users in a really simple and lightweight way, in the process providing technologists and IT departments very interesting things that they can be doing to lower costs or even to get much more nimble in terms of experimentation. And we'll talk about a couple of those. So in terms of the benefit, I've listed some really sort of broad ones here. The simplest really way to look at it, frankly, is that we're talking about a nice, easy utility model where the lowest level of detail, the server, the CPU, the box, is really kind of taken out of the realm of worry, where we're really consuming this virtually as a service. And so, when we look at it, we see it having the ability, especially in insurance, to really kind of help coordinate across channels because it is so easy to serve applications in really disparate environments. There's a whole series of workflow enablement tools that come along with this. And then just the ability to tighten business cycles. We often use the example of, if we think of a traditional IT project, there's certainly 3 to 4 weeks that in most project plans, if you thought about, a project plan 10 years ago for a large implementation, that would really be kind of hinged on getting hardware provisioned, getting storage provisioned, getting network set up, and all these kinds of things. And a BA, frankly, can really take a lot of that work and compress it in the development stage down to hours, frankly. Even in environments that are a little bit more technically oriented, like Amazon's EC2 service, you can take much of that time out of the development cycle and really kind of pull all of that work and, frankly, a lot of the large CapEx out of it until you've validated or proven that you're ready to go to production if you want to have and host products in your own environment on a traditional stack, let's say. Where really the most value comes from this is this emerging series of products and offerings that are really taking software and layering it onto this utility model. So, we're using web distribution, mobile networks. We're serving it from very lightweight infrastructure in the cloud. We get rid of a lot of the issues around, how do I have third parties accessing applications in my environment? Do I need Citrix? Do I need licensing for that? So much of the cost, even just in Blue Cod's model internally of delivering applications to agents, to third parties, is actually wrapped up in just this, how do I get applications out the door and put them on the business user's desktop? Because we're talking about models that are served from third parties, they're largely web-based, they have all the security wrapping, so much of that is taken up for you and simply allows you to avoid a lot of those costs and a lot of the issues. So, from my perspective, certainly, we're talking about a utility model like electricity of computing power, but on top of that, we're actually talking about a way to simplify distribution, to simplify the delivery of software, and really make IT kind of a true procurement group in some respects, as opposed to all just simply about the technology. The big question is certainly, where and how do you place these benefits? And I think this is kind of the crux of the challenge for many, many people. This might not be something that most insurers, whether small, medium, large, or organizations as a whole, want to think about as a mechanism to deliver all of their infrastructure. I wouldn't recommend that. The question is, where do you drive these benefits and where do you see fit? So certainly the first places we see are in the development environments and the testing environments where you can have multiple vendors inside, outside of your firewall accessing applications and infrastructure. And you can kind of do that, frankly, at extremely low cost. You can create these environments, you can tear them up, tear them down in very, very short order, and you get rid of so many of the items. Imagine if today, if I wanted to have a vendor come in and operate in Blue Cod's environment, let's say, just getting the security controls in place, just getting them set up in my environment would take a matter of weeks. We have a whole series of controls through our audit process and through our auditors and our IT security organization that we have to go through, and those are there for a good reason. In this model, there's lots of ways that I can set up infrastructure outside of my walls. I can give lots of people access to that. I can have all of the security wrapping that I desire, but I get rid of so many of those risks by bringing people into my environment. So let's keep going, and remember, if you've got any questions, just pop them into the messenger and point them to Karen. I think one of the biggest challenges is really by size of organization, frankly, right? So where does this fit and what are the benefits? What's so interesting is that, in my opinion, and I think Blue Cod's kind of opinion, and most third parties' opinions, the real benefit is actually on the smaller side of the market. There's going to be benefit to the enterprise class carrier. Don't worry too much about that. But the real sort of game-changing opportunity is for the smaller startups and the small to medium-sized carriers. You know, if you think about the last 10 years trajectory in IT spending, so much of it in the large carriers has really been, you know, it's been a sort of an Armageddon, right, where they're spending massive amounts of dollars on really capable agency systems, internal systems, on their architecture, on their infrastructure. And it's been very difficult for small and medium-sized carriers to compete, as well as to be nimble enough, just because the operating and the capital expenditures are so heavy. So, you know, here's where a medium-sized or a small shop or you know, two people in a garage, frankly, can have access to unlimited computing resources for very short periods of time, can access really best-in-class technology, frankly. I mean, the kind of infrastructure that certainly that we've spent money on for our private cloud, from, you know, Cisco, EMC, NetApp, VMware, Dell, you name it, is accessible to really anyone at very low cost on a by-the-byte sort of purchase plan. And so you're looking at the ability to really start up technology projects, to experiment, to play very, very quickly and at very, very low cost. And so where, you know, large carriers are going to have to figure out how this fits into their plans, because they probably already have much longer vendor contracts, they've got longer service contracts, they might already have the equivalent of a private cloud, but they've got all the enterprise sort of issues and speed issues that go along with it, where in small and medium-sized carriers, there's just an opportunity to couple this with standards and open source to really, really quickly build technology and define new kind of opportunities. The story I always tell is when we think about, you know, building out new software companies. My background is in the software universe some years ago, and, you know, we would typically look at building an enterprise application that was software, let's say, and that's, you know, that was always a very typical $5 to $15 to $20 million expenditure, and, you know, 15–20% of that was just on building infrastructure to enable that software to serve clients, to create products. You know, 15% of that, 20% of that, 50% of that in some cases has gone away. You don't need to spend those dollars anymore. I had a really interesting discussion with a company that we spent a lot of time talking to, and who's our carrier. And, you know, they think about their IT budget. This takes kind of 10% of their IT budget out, because they don't really have to worry as much about building development environment and testing environments. They're going to spend money. There's lots of carriers who won't actually save a penny. They'll just get the nimbleness. But there are others who have really deep, rich environments where they can literally cut out all of that development environment, all of that infrastructure, and frankly save themselves lots of headaches and costs. In the small side of the universe also, you know, we just see IT departments that are really stretched, where we've got small groups trying to maintain both hardware, storage, and software, and those skill sets are rapidly expanding. They're changing every day, and just managing the certifications necessary to maintain a piece of Dell hardware that runs a certain CPU type with a Windows operating system on it. There's a lot of work there. These kinds of models can really take that out. So here's some benefits. You know, I really do think it weighs certainly more heavily right now on the smaller side. You know, on the enterprise side, as they really work this into the model, which will take them longer, there'll be benefit as well. And just to, you know, to say it again, the reality is that this might, for some carriers, only be about changing you know, CapEx to OpEx, frankly. But there's benefit there, and there's benefit in terms of the nimbleness as well as in the time. And so we'll talk about some examples in a second. Let's talk a little bit about some of the adoption issues. You know, I think this is, when I'm speaking to a non-insurance audience, you know, we typically kind of put this slide in and say, look, you know, the world thinks of insurance as kind of a little bit behind everyone and slow. The reality is that we in most cases actually have every right and need to be like that. And the reason is because we have a very complex business. There's a track record of frankly being burnt by a lot of these solutions in our industry where people are trying to take banking technology or retail commerce technology and sort of shoehorn it into our environment. And it's difficult because there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of history. We carry, just on a data perspective, we carry far more transactional history in the insurance business than any other industry that I know of. So our needs functionally are pretty different. And look, you know, as with all of these trends, the focus on the technology will kill us, right? And the solution is really what's important. And so, you know, we have to get to a point where we actually understand what this is doing for us. And I think without that, there's failure. The last point, I think, is really the other kind of sea change that's going on. And that is that, you know, how people are buying technology, who's worried about technology is changing. When we talk to sort of business leaders and IT leaders these days, the current kind of generation of managers, and I'm sure everyone on the phone, you know, business users think about technology very differently. It's not something they hand off. It's something they want control over. And we're seeing the IT realm become kind of strategic partners that are advisory focused to business people that now want to make decisions about technology. And the lines between those groups is kind of fundamentally blurred. And this is one of these things where we actually, interestingly enough, when we talk to IT people, we hear that they're getting asked about this a lot by their business users, and business users are saying, hey, how do we use this? Where, you know, I think if this were 10 years ago, this would really be about IT users going to business people and saying, look, we've got an opportunity to change the balance between operating expense and capital expense. You know, where would you like us to take advantage of this? And so it's just changing the tenor of the discussion. And so I think when you add all these things together, you're seeing a reason for adoption to change, for the way people are thinking about using technology to alter and change a little bit. So, you know, I think this kind of brings us to the larger part of the discussion. Yes, this is a technology. It's, you know, a utility model. There's a whole reason it can change kind of how you spend on technology. It doesn't live in isolation, though, and I think the reason that partially we're struggling with adoption or we're trying to understand where it fits is that the universe is also changing around us. And so, you know, people's preferences for how they consume technology is changing vastly. If you looked at a typical agent who's sitting in front of a policy admin system, you know, their level of education around technology and what good user interface and technology is and how they want to consume that has fundamentally changed. They've been taught by, you know, 18 other companies who are building cutting-edge technology in other industries, what cutting-edge technology should look like and how it should feel and how it should be used. And so their demands are changing really dramatically. You know, everyone is an expert user of the web, and that's a very different situation than 10 years ago. So not only do you have different preferences from an infrastructure perspective, it means that the volume of work they're doing on your systems are changing, how much they're using them is changing. We even just see very simple things where a box that served a web app 5 years ago is no longer able to serve the same audience just because they're using it so much more intensely than they were 5 years ago because that audience is just smarter about how to use it. Crowdsourcing and open source are fundamentally intertwined with this. You know, when we talk about the sort of the cloud, really the human corollary to it is crowdsourcing. And the open source environment in some respects is what has made this all work. And I'll talk in a minute about some examples of those and how they fit. People these days are frankly collaborating at a vastly different pace than they were 2 or 3 years ago. If you think about the sort of amount of interactions you have with your colleagues today, with people inside and outside of your walls, with the expectation about kind of how quickly you'll think through and work and ideate on problems, it's just fundamentally different. And it means that, you know, how people are working is changing, but also people's ability to focus is sort of fundamentally different. Everyone works in IT. That's our way of kind of offering up the parable around how business and IT have changed. That, you know, look, business people think of themselves as IT folks at some level, or at least they think they're responsible for it or in it. And then, you know, blurring the lines. So what does it all mean? You know, and I think the big thing, we talked a little bit about the cloud as a way to lower CapEx on hardware and infrastructure. You know, what's the new bottleneck? And I think what we see is really that focus is replacing CapEx as the bottleneck. You know, how do you how do you kind of worry through the 15 different things you want to do and you can very quickly do? Well, you got to figure out what the focus is. I sort of tell the story of myself where I have an Amazon cloud account, and I have probably 6 or 7 open source tools on that account that I've kind of created and lit up, and I've offered out to people in our organization to sort of play with. And I found myself about a year ago having gotten nowhere with any of them just because there's so many of them. It's like, which one do you pick? Which one do you choose? What do you play with? You know, and 10 years ago, I wouldn't have had the dollars to go light up 10 environments with 10 different products on them. But, you know, now lighting up a whole series of open source products is really easy to do. And, you know, focus was the issue. It wasn't about cost. You know, the back office in Blue Card, we know this all too well. You know, we're basically an insurance company that doesn't carry risk. So our back office is directly connected to our IT organization. We have a large servicing and processing environment. And those decisions, you know, how we think about using these technologies can really have impact downstream in our environment. And so, you know, they tend to cause us to have to really pause and understand how we're doing things and what the impacts are. Where to deploy or employ, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's a whole series of choices here. You know, how do you filter the trends? How do you think about it? This is part of the reason why we started doing these webinars, just to sort of have an open conversation about people around what trends we think are interesting and how people can maybe use them. And then the fundamental question, right? How's this actually going to improve your business? You know, I think certainly there's a whole series of opinions out there right now that say, you know, the place to start is in the things you want to test, where you've got a hypothesis about something that you'd like to use, try it out. Where there's a short point need, there's a place to use it. And I think that's probably right. Let's talk a little bit about kind of who offers these things, what the companies are, and how they all combine. We have a series of products we use in-house that we think are interesting. And there's a series of companies out there that I always point to as great examples. You know, the second bullet point in that first set, the crowdsourcing and open source, that's really the kind of key set of items that are combining with cloud to offer interesting things. So, you know, people talk a lot about Amazon. It's kind of the granddaddy of the cloud environment. So, you know, Amazon, the large retailer, discovered X number of years ago they had lots of server capacity, and they built a model internally for how they could share that capacity amongst their developers. And, you know, one day someone had a great idea about maybe we could share this more globally. So if you go into your browser and you Google, you know, Amazon Cloud or Amazon EC2, you'll see what has become a really incredibly rich offering with lots and lots of kind of components wrapped around it, to the point where, you know, in that environment, and I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday, I could go in and within an hour I could have a virtual network created with many kind of pieces of hardware up and running, different tools, that was connected into my network here on a very specific subnet with the same firewall settings, and I could pay for that by the minute and do it at extremely low cost. The Amazon model is very simple. You know, you pay for how much CPU cycle and at what power you consume it, and then how much data you've got stored, and then how much data comes in and comes out. It's a very, very simple model. And so we use it, I use it a lot, actually, even just personally, to play with things, right? To light up open source tools that we're investigating, to create servers, to test things. And if you haven't and you're in IT, I'd encourage you to go out and take a look at it. Set up a server. You could create a CRM system through one of their pre-configured images in a matter of minutes. It's staggering. It's really very incredible. It's supported by a massive community of people who can kind of have created articles, can guide you through their forum environment on how to do these things. You can create Windows boxes, Linux boxes, anything you're running. I guarantee you can create it in there. Where there's the crowdsourcing piece, you know, funnily enough, Amazon are also the guys who have actually driven much of the crowdsourcing environment. They created a tool called Mechanical Turk a number of years ago, which is a way to distribute and send work out to people. The example I always use when it gained the most notoriety was, I don't know if everyone remembers, there's a gentleman by the name of Steve Fawcett who was sort of an international explorer, and he had a plane crash in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they couldn't figure out how to scan the satellite images fast enough or with enough sort of exactness to really try and find pictures of the wreckage of this airplane crash in these mountains, and there was no computer software that was available that could kind of spot these differences. And so they went to Mechanical Turk, and they put a project out there that I think was, for every square mile you scan on a map, we'll give you 50 cents. It's a fascinating tool. We've used it for our CAT drills, where we need people to call in scenarios. You can set up jobs, create work very, very simply for very, very piecemeal pieces. And so all of a sudden what you've got is not only a utility model of computing, but you've got a utility model of accessing resources. One of the most interesting examples of those kind of two things combined that we see is actually a local company, or I see, is a local company near us, just outside of Marlborough, called UTest, who have actually created a crowdsourcing model based on cloud infrastructure and a SaaS, software as a service tool set for testing. They have access to a massive network of professional testers. They have a tool that allows you to send them code and allows them to test and send it back to you. It has vastly changed the pricing model to where you can get, onshore U.S. testing skills with people who understand insurance, who have worked in, probably your specific line of business, who will actually test your software and do it at a rate that's far cheaper than sending it offshore. And it's one of these examples where, yes, look, there's lots of fluff when people talk about cloud and crowdsourcing, but here's a really concrete example of someone who's not only able to kind of lower your cost to test software and test applications, they can probably do it at a higher level of quality than you could get elsewhere, and they can do it in a way that's really minimally disruptive and lower cost than you could do internally. It's a great, great example. The other one that I think is really interesting is a company called LiveOps, and if you've ever heard of LiveOps, LiveOps, I think, is now the largest operator of call centers in the U.S., and it's a purely onshore U.S. at-home service model. And, there's an example where someone basically has an application that gets delivered to any PC that's got a microphone and a set of speakers to it, and they can basically manage massive flows of calls. And so those are sort of some granddaddy examples, if you will, of people that are using this technology and using it really effectively. And these are all kind of tools that any small organization can go out and access and use to great cost savings. I was having a conversation a week ago with one of the Fair Plan who, was looking at trying to figure out how to do call centers in a slightly different way. And, of course, there's a whole series of great cloud-based call center solutions out there that will allow you to do what 5 years ago was only available in a $200,000, Cisco or Lucent switch, and they'll do it fully virtually. And those are opportunities to have technology that is what, Geico was using 10 years ago for one millionth of the cost, frankly. So, all of these trends, open source software, crowdsourcing, cloud, SaaS, they're all really combining into a world where, for 10, 15 years, large companies have had the run of really modern and flexible solutions. They've been able to kind of beat up the smaller side of the market with their solutions. But all of these things are combining to a point where at least we can all be at parity. And where, smaller budgets and vendors like ours can kind of bring really solid and slick technology to bear to serve the smaller side of the market and do so, frankly, in a way that is incredibly effective. So, always bear in mind around this, whether you think about it, these things are all really deeply intertwined, and I think the value that we can drive from these things actually relies on them to be that way. So, how do we ease adoptions? And in some respects, this is meant for anyone that's on the tech side and maybe even a vendor. But, look, the reality is that these are not one-size-fits-all solutions. Going to Amazon and lighting up a server will not work in a major, large company. That's just not going to work with their security protocol. But in smaller companies where you can carve out rules and say, look, if we're just testing something or working on it, that's a valid way to go. There's different solutions out there for different sizes. If you're looking at a model where you'd like to take kind of your development outfit, you don't like the roll your own model of an Amazon, there's plenty of enterprise class infrastructure providers who will provide you with a cloud-based option, and they'll do it with a supported model. Blue Cloud is one of those. There's people like Savis who will provide a 24/7, very, very high uptime set of SLAs. for a cloud-based solution that looks like the Amazon one. It's slightly differently priced, but it provides you with a lot of the same benefits, but with also all of the security and service levels around it. You know, for the vendor universe, you know, don't recognize the market as conservative, or recognize it as conservative, sorry, but it's not about being a laggard. It's really about how do you use these things properly. And look, you know, find someone who's kind of experienced in delivering this stuff in a smart way. It's not for everything, it's not for everyone, and you've got to pick and choose. You know, as with all of these items, the question is kind of how do you fit it into your environment, and how do you fit it in a proper and interesting way. So, if you jump forward for me, James, you know, I think the biggest point here is that it's actually not about the technology, right? It's about how we deliver functionality, how we do it quickly, and to do it in a way that isn't necessarily about the excitement, and look, the geek in me gets excited about it, but it isn't about that. It's about really, you know, delivering functionality and fitting this into the broader series of goals you've got. You know, whether it's about taking the list of 5 things that you haven't been able to get to, that this might provide you with a really quick way of setting up an environment, letting a business user test an application, try it out, see if they're interested with it, where there's no wake, if you will, on your traditional environment, or whether it's a strategic opportunity. I mean, in our case, we've kind of gone and changed our sales management tools in our environment, and we've chosen to take it kind of out of our core infrastructure and use purely our cloud with an open source solution to revamp how we manage our sales processes internally. And then, is this a short-term or a long-term thing? I mean, we talked to a number of companies who are using Amazon or Savvis or even Rackspace, and it's really just an interim solution as they get solutions set up. Let's say they're either waiting for hardware or they're doing a test run or a soft open. They're fitting these things in as a way to get to their long-term solution and to do it without having to really kind of kill themselves to get there or to disrupt projects. I think the big benefit and the big change is that we're really breaking down kind of one of the core barriers that has always existed, which is, you know, this was technology versus operations versus functionality, and the reality is this allows us to kind of break down out of that. And, you know, I'm not necessarily a technologist. I'm not someone who could ever go and write a lick of code, but, you know, all of these technologies have allowed people like me and people like everyone on the phone, if you're not a technologist, to really go out and play with technology, play with open source items, and to do so in a really quick and interesting way. And it might even be just about understanding if something can help your organization that you're later going to go and buy. And I think that's one of the great benefits. So, you know, if there's anything you want to take away from this, I think you can take away the fact that, you know, we're sort of changing the types of and ways you can consume infrastructure. It's changing how you get to think about infrastructure, and it's really a delivery mechanism. It's the sort of rails that all of these other trends around cloud sourcing and open source and software that's really configurable by users and as a service. It's the infrastructure that all of those things can ride on and that you can deliver. And not only, it also allows you to change kind of how you're delivering technology. The caveat we always leave people with is, look, you know, yes, when we talk about things like SaaS or user configurability or using open source tools, it doesn't mean that you get to break down your process. You know, good process that has high quality BA work, high quality testing work, and code review, all of that work still remains. We're just changing how it happens. We're changing some of the components. We might get to take time out of setting up infrastructure or in creating kind of code that's repeatable that we could get from somewhere else, but you still have to have all of the other wrappers around it. And I think it's the one great error that people make is that they sort of assume that we all of a sudden get to break out of what certainly for some business people can be a tough set of processes. So we always leave people with that. You know, the development process, your life cycle process isn't going to change. What's going to change are the things within it, if you will. So those are really the prepared set of remarks we've got. And if there's any question, we'd love to open it up to that or any discussion that's of interest. James?
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, we have received a number of questions, and we do encourage you to go ahead and submit further questions so we can have this be a true discussion. So just a reminder, if you'd like to submit a question, just hover over the chat box icon at the top of your screen and send a direct message to Karen, and we'll have Simon field it for you. So the first question we received is, could you use the cloud for disaster recovery purposes?
Sure, and so it's actually one of the use cases that lots of people talk about, and I think there's quite a lot of use about it. Certainly, there's lots of different ways to go. So there's a traditional, if you think about recovery or DR as kind of a hot site where you've literally got 2 sites up and running at all times, you can use the cloud for that. In many respects, that's not necessarily a cost-effective way to use it if you want kind of a full-time hot site. I think the most interesting use we see is where people are using it as the standby infrastructure where they can fail over to an Amazon service or a Savvis service or a Rackspace service that they've already got fully configured. So the example I'd give you is we have one client who uses Amazon. Actually, they have what's called a virtual private cloud, which is just one that's kind of boxed for you only, and that you can connect into your infrastructure and your firewalls. And they have that fully set up. They've got all of the servers configured, and they have images of their live servers configured there. And if they ever have a failure, they go from their backups directly to Amazon and they light it up there. So it's a great example of how you can do that. There's also other interesting examples where the sort of cloud or crowdsourcing stuff can get used for DR. You know, if you've got a massive set of snowstorms and you're going to miss a series of transactions, there are people that use things like Mechanical Turk for that, where they're going to fill in for very simple transactions that they need done. You can literally use those tools for that, and it's actually one of the, when we think about Blue Cloud as kind of a private cloud, we actually do a lot of that for our clients, where we're using our infrastructure as a non-committed way for them to have a DR environment.
Great. So the next question is, how does the cloud fit into a company's security structure? Sure. And there can be ways it fits and there's ways it doesn't fit. It really depends on sort of what the structure is. So there are services that you can absolutely configure into your environment, if you will, where you can literally create what would be called, I guess, a subnet on your core network, and that cloud service is basically just feels like something inside of your firewall. And there are simple ways to do that across all the vendors that I know of. There are absolutely some restrictions on that. If you've got very specific kind of hardware or things like that, it might not necessarily work. The most common example is you can certainly take, let's say, if you're a Microsoft shop and you're using Microsoft's authentication, you can absolutely use that on these servers. So where 3 or 4 or 5 years ago these look like completely separate environments, they're now can look much more like integrated environments that are sort of inside of your 4 walls. They just happen to kind of be virtually inside of your 4 walls as opposed to inside of your 4 walls. Great. The next question we have is, what are the associated costs of implementing a cloud model?
Sure. So, the core cost is really around, obviously, the set of servers and the operating expense around keeping those going. All of the vendors, Rackspace, Amazon, Savvis, you name it, they all have calculators for the ongoing costs on their site. In terms of the infrastructure, there's really no setup costs, but in some respects that's kind of the hitch. This does require work. It requires someone to think through and plan through these things. For the cheaper the solution, the more sort of legwork there is in terms of understanding the technology and getting things set up. But the reality is, in many respects, actually, it won't look any different than setting up a piece of hardware in your environment. If you have an infrastructure person or you are one, you're literally, it's like buying a piece of hardware and setting it up, installing it without the setting it up and installing it. You're lighting an image up virtually, and then you're literally just getting the addresses of that box, securing it in whatever method you want to, and then going through it. It shouldn't look like it takes any more time than that, but there are certainly cases where there's a learning curve, especially on something like Amazon, which is it's a little bit technical and it's just a different way of thinking about the universe. So the cost should be similar to what you do now, just without any of the hardware, frankly. And then if there's any more questions, just shoot them into us.
Well, it looks like that's it. If you do have any questions that you think of going forward, feel free to email us at communications@bluecod.com. We'd be glad to set you up with Simon, and he'd love to help. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.